Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 7th, 2025. It's Friday, so I'm going to take your questions. And there are two general questions that I've received from a lot of you, and then a couple of specific ones that I hope to get to in the course of this discussion. But let's start with one that came from a number of people. What the hell's going on in Europe? You have Macron talking about the French nuclear umbrella. You have the British and the French leaders saying they're prepared to send troops and take on Russia. We see the break occurring between the United States and NATO. And the question is, why is it that the Europeans seem to want war? Now, it shouldn't be so surprising because until Trump got in, the United States was the main supporter of the war. This was Biden's war, but Biden, on behalf of the international globalist cartels, committed to a war against Russia, to break down Russia, to defeat Russia. And they sold it to the Europeans, and the Europeans were skeptical at first, but then they bought in. They made a commitment to Biden in the United States. And now that Trump has broken with Biden, the Europeans don't seem to know what to do. They're flapping their gums. They're talking about military spending and taking on Russia. So let's take a look at what is actually behind this. First, you have just old-fashioned Russophobia. The same thing that existed during the Cold War against the Soviets, well, it's still against the Russians. You have the Baltic states, which are acting crazy, Poland, Scandinavia. But then you have the geopolitical side of it, which is largely what shapes the reaction in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. The idea that Russia represents a threat as opposed to a potential ally. This is in particular shaped by the British geopolitical doctrine of Mackinder. It's also related to the so-called special relationship, the United Kingdom alliance with the United States, which basically means how can the UK manipulate the United States for its own purposes? Now, what else is going on? You have collapsing economies in Europe, especially Germany, where you have deindustrialization, inflation, high energy prices, a complete mess. And now the new chancellor is the former head of BlackRock Germany, a vulture fund, someone who's going to be looking out for the interests of the private corporations, which is mainly the cause of the problem in the first place. In France, you have Macron, a puffed-up Napoleon-type figure who's highly unpopular, 75% disapproval rating. Comes from the globalist bankers. He worked for the Rothschilds. And he's talking about going to war with Russia and using the French nuclear umbrella. And in the UK, you have the absurdity of a country which has 18% poverty level, and that's probably a low estimate, 25% children living under poverty, and yet committing huge amounts of money to a war that can't be won. So what's the other side of this? Well, what does militarization mean? Spending on military. This is a way to reflate the economy, the way it'll make it look as though the economy is moving in the right direction. But the reality is that in order to reflate, they've got to cut spending, which means cutting wages, cutting social welfare programs, cutting infrastructure, cutting education, cutting health care. What's going to be the effect of that? It will make these governments more unpopular. So what you have to realize is that the Europeans who are pushing for this continued war and who are upset that Trump is saying we're going to end the war in Ukraine, they're essentially stuck in a virtual reality where they think that spending on the military will solve everything and eventually the U.S. will come around and become part of their policy. It's not going to work, and it's a catastrophe for Europe. And the only question is, when will the European people wake up and do something about it? Now, the second question is from someone who's pro-Trump, pro-MAGA, and who really supports what the president's doing to end the war in Ukraine, but then asks the question, why does he support Netanyahu and the war in Gaza? Now, Trump has a grand design in mind, the Abraham Accords, to bring peace between the Arabs and the Israelis, win a Nobel Prize, and so on. The problem he has is that if he supports Netanyahu, he's not going to have support from the Arab governments, because Netanyahu is pushing for the ethnic cleansing of Israel, the Greater Israel policy, drive the Palestinians out, or suppress them into cheap labor, slaves essentially for the Israeli tech economy. The Saudis and the Arab governments say no displacement of Palestinians should be acceptable, and they want a two-state solution. Doesn't Trump see that? Well, you have a real disconnect here, because what he sees is that Ukraine is being used by the globalists against Russia, to break up Russia, and to put the United States in a confrontational posture with Russia as opposed to a normalized relationship. But with the Middle East, Israel is the same as Ukraine in Europe. Israel was set up as an operation, a geopolitical wedge to be used to keep the great powers at each other's throats. And so the geopolitical goal in Ukraine and Israel is the same. Break up the great powers, break up Russia, break up China, break up the BRICS. Now, the second problem Trump has, and that, by the way, is the first problem he has, that I don't think he understands that, for whatever reason. The second problem is Islamic terrorism, and the idea that it's popular to stand up and fight against the groups like ISIS and Islamic Jihad and Hamas and so on. There's a problem here. The Islamic terrorists are also geopolitical tools that have been invented and nurtured by European and Western elites. Just ask Michael Flynn. President Trump had appointed him to be his national security advisor in his first term, and the deep state drove him out. He was one of the first victims of Russiagate. Why? Because Flynn, as the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, understood that the CIA and other government agencies, along with non-governmental organizations, were using Islamic terrorism for their own purposes, for the purpose of war, and targeting U.S. interests around the world. So this was a policy of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration. They all supported this. This is what Hillary Clinton wanted to do with Syria, and Trump effectively countered that in the 2016 campaign. So why doesn't he see that this time? That Israel is being used as a wrecking ball on behalf of British U.S. imperial interests? Well, the solution to this is, if you're a builder and you want to build, go with LaRouche's Oasis plan. The Egyptians came out with a proposal for this. There's a potential now to bring fresh water as the basis for an incentive for cooperation between Arab and Israeli states. So this is the obvious answer, but I think he's got to solve the problem of the fear of the Muslim world, and secondly, understanding that Israel has always been an instrument of British geopolitics. That doesn't mean that it's all the Jewish people in Israel who are the problem. It's the radical Zionists, the Greater Israel faction. That's the problem, and that's something that Trump has to face. Now, the third question, and this is from a number of you, how do you organize? When I talk to my friends, they don't seem to be in the real world. How can I change them? How do you stick with the truth when people seem so ignorant because of the narrative of the mainstream media? Well, be patient. Reality and truth will ultimately bring people around. 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought we'd have a government that's moving against the deep state, that's moving to end these wars. So don't despair. But most importantly, keep the focus on the big picture. That's where the problem is. That if you can break people down into identity politics and use the profiles, the psychological profiles, to manipulate them, you'll never organize them. So you have to realize that the policies being pushed by the World Economic Forum, by NATO, the European Union, these policies won't work. The global corporate cartels that are trying to set up a global bankers dictatorship, it's not going to work. It's going to harm the people that you're trying to organize. So stick with positive solutions, like the Oasis Plan, like the idea of a new security and development architecture. Study Helga Zepp-LaRouche's fundamental principles and use these higher conceptions to uplift people, get them out of their pessimism, get them to see that human civilization has the capacity to solve these problems, provided you keep your eyes to the heavens instead of to your belly button. And I think that's the most important thing, is don't despair. Now today at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll have this week's International Peace Coalition call. There's a link to it in the description box. If you can't make it for the live discussion, you can pick it up on the archive discussion later. But this is where you'll see people actually discussing and fighting for the ideas that will solve these problems. And then the bigger picture includes May 24th and 25th, an International Schiller Institute conference in the New York City area, under the title, A Beautiful Vision for Humanity in Times of Great Turbulence. I'm putting a registration link in the description box. This is the kind of thing that you have enough time now. We're talking about 2 months from now, a little more than 2 months. So you can organize friends to join you there and take part in the kind of discussion which is necessary to not just save the United States, but to save the human race. So thanks for joining me this week. Share this video and make sure you keep up that optimism by looking at the big picture. That's always the solution.